we do find is this complete absence of debris, but then stuff starts to show up. And it's quite evident that it was planted. And this particular example is a very nice illustration. It was even moved around and photographed from more than one location, as though they could thereby multiply the amount of evidence they had that a Boeing 757 had actually hit the building. But the point I was coming to, too, is this. So the fires were put out relatively early, but later you have these billowing black clouds coming up from the Pentagon. And if you study the photographs, it turns out they're coming from a series of enormous dumpsters. In other words, the billowing black smoke, which would be visible to all the members of Congress who are rushed out of the Capitol on the ground that maybe the Capitol was the next target, they would look across the Potomac and see all this billowing dark black smoke. But in fact, it's coming from dumpsters. It's a special effect. I had a fellow come through Duluth when I was still living there about 2 years ago now, and he had 44 additional frames that showed the dumpsters, the smoke coming from the dumpsters, and it was from a different angle than the frames I had available to me. And you could actually see daylight in between the dumpsters and the building, and it was obvious it was coming from the dumpsters, not from the building. So what I'm telling you is this government has been conning us, playing us for saps, and using, of course, this whole fabricated event as a justification for these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which are in violation of international law, the UN Charter, even the U.S. Constitution, and, of course, for passing the Patriot Act, which takes away some of our most fundamental rights under the Constitution, putting the whole country under surveillance. And anyone who thinks they were actually doing a surveillance on terrorists doesn't understand. This was for domestic political purposes. They've been putting the whole country under surveillance. And then, of course, going about, and I think even blackmailing members of the Congress to induce them to support this Liability Immunity Act for the huge telecommunication giant so that they'll never be published for violating the law on behalf of an administration that is completely out of control.
We're back on the Real News. That was our interview with James Fetzer. The interview in its entirety will be on our website and our YouTube channel, therealnewsradio.com. We're going to take a break now, and we will come back with your phone calls here in just a few minutes. Okay, we're back on The Real News, and we're going to go to the phones here in just a moment. The Real News crew met Senator Doyle last week. She was in town, and we asked her several questions, which is on our YouTube channel, but we wanted to play just one for you, and we're going to go to that clip right now. This past week, we saw the Republicans, the rebel Republicans, staying in the Congress after it had adjourned, wanting an up or down vote on drilling offshore. What's your opinion on that, and what do you think we need to do to get this country more fixed on a stable gas policy?
Right. Well, first of all, we are about 58-60% dependent on foreign sources of oil. And that's like Chavez's Venezuela and Putin's Russia and Ahmadinejad's Iran, and that is totally unacceptable. We've got to become independent. Now, how do you do it? You put everything on the table. I like to describe it as putting everything, including the kitchen sink. And then you develop a comprehensive policy, energy policy, and you do it quickly. So I've called on the president to call a summit to try to do this. I think you have to look at it two ways. One is short term. How do we get the price of gasoline down short term? You can do it by taking about a third of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and selling it. And that would show the speculators we really mean business here, and it would bring down the price. In terms of, I've also called on the president to set up a task force on oil and gas market fraud. In other words, to have the Justice Department looking at whether there's manipulation of the market or whether there's any corruption. So that's short term. Drilling, I think the state has to make the decision, lift the moratorium, which would let the governor then decide he can dot every T, dot every I and cross every T, and look carefully at whether this is in the interests of North Carolina. I personally feel that, if it's 50 miles offshore, and with the change in technologies just in the last few years where you can do it very strategically, for example, you can drill a hole about the size of a closet and reach out for 5 miles. And there are a number of other technological developments even beyond that. So it can be done, I think, in an environmentally safe way. and it would mean that 37.5% of the revenues would go to the state for the sale of that petroleum. And what would it mean? Well, maybe beach renourishment, things of that sort, dredging that the coast needs. So put that on the table. Look at the Rocky Mountain area, where apparently with the development of technology there, and this would be oil shale. By extracting the oil shale, we would have 3 times the reserves of Saudi Arabia, which is amazing. So, there are many different ways. Conserve energy, you bet. But we need a crash course in conserving in this country. We really do. And certainly alternative sources of energy. So go after it all in a comprehensive package. And I think this has really got the attention of people now. We have a good chance of coming up with a comprehensive policy.
Okay, we're back on The Real News. If you'd like to see that interview in its entirety, it's on our YouTube channel. You can go to our website, therealnewsradio.com, and link to it from there. And, of course, our email is onair at therealnewsradio.com. Our phone numbers are 704-873-1400 and 336-499-0681 is our Davie County number if you'd like to comment on our interview with James Fetzer. Again, we're doing a special, The Fact and the Fiction of 9/11. I would